Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, I'm talking to Lea Ypi about her remarkable new book, Indignity, A Life Reimagined. It tells the story of her grandmother's extraordinary life. It also uncovers a hidden history of Europe in the middle of the 20th century. And it's about many of the philosophies of dignity that Lea and I have been discussing, and how they can impact, make, break, destroy a human life. We're going to try and pull all of that together. Lea, we've been talking about dignity and the history, the philosophy of the concept. You have written a book called Indignity. It's not a work of philosophy. It is a work of memoir, of narrative history, the reimagining of a life, your grandmother's life. And yet it contains in it a lot of the themes that we were talking about. And as we were talking, I found myself thinking, this is in the book. This is in the book. It's not a work of philosophy, but there's real philosophy in there. And I'd like to get to it. But I think to get to it, because almost everyone listening to this will not yet have read the book, we probably need to say a bit more about the story, the narrative, so people can make the connection. So let's start with that. And then I'd really love to hear, not least because it does begin with two lines, one from Kant and one from Schiller. So we have things to say about them too, but I don't think we can start there. Let's start with the photograph. So the spur for this book, not just for the writing of it, but for your desire to uncover the story that's in it, is a photograph. Just tell us about the photograph and how the photograph led to the book.
Yeah, so it starts with a text message that I received from a friend saying that my grandmother had become viral on Facebook. And sure enough, I went to check and I discovered that a photo of her that I had never seen before in my life had been posted on social media by someone I had also never heard before, with hundreds of derogatory comments. You know, as one does when these things go viral, you get a lot of comments from various people using social media. And there were two things that were really striking about the photo. So the one, first of all, was, as I say, this photo was clearly taken on my grandmother's honeymoon in the Italian Dolomites in the winter of 1941, which is when she was traveling with my grandfather, having just gotten married. Albania was under Italian fascist occupation. It was much easier during the war to travel to Italy from Albania because it was part of the same country. And so she'd gone to spend her honeymoon, and she's always talked about this. And I recognize, because I recognize the name of the hotel in the background of the photo, she'd always talked about this honeymoon, but I had always thought throughout my life that all photos from this period of her life had disappeared, because my grandfather was arrested by the communists in 1946 when they just come to power in Albania. And as part of that process, all her family photos had been confiscated. And so everything from her youth, every photo in which she appeared with my grandfather, was just not available anymore. We couldn't see it. She had lost them, but she didn't know where they were. They'd just been confiscated. So this was the first thing that was really strange. And so I was kind of struck because I saw this photo of her that was taken from this period that I knew, and she talked about this. She always said something very strange, that was that this was the happiest time of her life. And it was very weird for me because you kind of think, what sort of person can be the happiest person in the world in 1941, in the winter of 1941?
Yeah, it should say the winter of 1941 in Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, was about the low point in the whole 20th century history.
Exactly. So this for me was like, when Stalingrad happened and their Yugoslavia had been taken over, and it's just, you think of just horror and bloodshed. And of course, my grandmother had always spoken about this as the time of her honeymoon, but without me being able to have any mental images of that period because it was just completely lost in the past. And so suddenly this photo appeared that was really strange and in a strange context. And then under the photo, there were a lot of comments about her saying that she'd been a fascist spy or she'd been a communist spy. Some comments were about me because in part it was connected to the reception of my other book, Free. And so a lot of people somehow knew about the family. It was in media in Albania. And this raised the question of, on the one hand, you see this photo of someone that you've known really well, but then you also just don't know them at all as they appear in the photograph, because it's from a time that you don't know anything about. And somehow this life that she had been talking about and that was there captured was completely different from the life and the person that I had known. And the second one, it raised the question of, why are these people doing this to my grandmother, and who are they, and how do they have the right to actually comment on her and to be so derogatory and to troll her on social media, when this is actually someone who is dead and has no capacity to defend themselves. And I've always taken the line with social media myself that when you encounter the trolls or whatever, you just ignore them, because this is just, just part of a public sphere, and somehow it's even worse than when you try and suppress it or if you try and engage and so on. But in this case, it was harder because it was directed at someone who just could not form those beliefs and those opinions herself. And so somehow it raised this question of dignity, which is a lot about some of the themes that we've also been talking actually in the previous episodes, which is, questions of legacy and death, and who can tell the story of a life after that person is just not there anymore, and how you relate to these dead people that are at one level your relatives, but on another level not connected to you because they're in the past and you lived with them in a time that's very different from the time in which they lived with. So doing more research, I discovered that the photo came from the archives of the former Secret Service in Albania, and that actually I could file a request and find out not just the photos, but also all the surveillance reports of spies who had been surveilling my grandmother throughout her youth after my grandfather was put in prison. And I could also find his trial documents, everything that was said about, why he was trialed. So basically I could reconstruct everything that would happen to my family from these family documents that were in the archives of the Secret Service. And that's triggered this. This was the beginning of a process in which I tried to piece together her life, in part based on these Secret Service archives and the documents that I found. But also, the more I researched this, the more I discovered that there were a lot of mysteries and a lot of gaps in the archives. And so, in part, it then became an effort to piece together what you find in the archives, but also to fill in the gaps of the things that you can't find. And this question of dignity was really present throughout, because it was present in the beginning as part of the search around legacy and, what happens, what is the dignity of a person? Do they have to be alive to protect their dignity? Is dignity this transcendental thing that actually is not really connected to our empirical existence? And then ways in which this notion of dignity was actually present throughout the 20th century and articulated, both appropriated and misused and manipulated by various actors at various points, sometimes with political motives, sometimes with other sort of self-interested motives. But it was clear that this was a time where dignity was really important and people talked about it. But on the other hand, that it was also very much abused as a word. And so the search was in part, and the book can be told as a family history, as a memoir, as a literary effort to reconstruct someone's life. But I think also a lot as a philosophical reflection on this concept of dignity applied to particular circumstances and connected to human lives.
You say at the beginning that when you saw this photograph, you wanted to, and this is the line you used, defend your grandmother's dignity. So what were you defending it from? So there's the abuse online, and you make it pretty clear you feel guilty about this, right? Because some of this is, as you say, because of you. You've become a public figure by this point. Free is a best-selling book. It's also in Albania a controversial book. And you cite some of the abuse. It's pretty unpleasant, and it connects the two of you. But is it also about rescuing her from the indignity of the archive itself? So when you go to the archive, and it's a complicated story, which we'll get onto, but the person that you think is your grandmother, and is in part your grandmother, is described as the object in the archive. She is the object of surveillance. We talked about this. One of the great indignities, not just of the 20th century, but maybe particularly of the 20th century, is the indignity that people suffer in surveillance states. And this is a pretty stark example of it. She is completely objectified in these official documents, and her life, as you describe in the book, there is from the happy photograph of the honeymoon when Europe is falling apart, but after the war, her life moves in a very, very different direction with the jailing of her husband. And there is much indignity with that too. So what did you think you were defending her from?
I think it started as this, first of all, effort to appropriate something that was very, very personal to her, and that you felt that as a family member who had actually never seen these photographs, even before getting to all the trolling and to the unpleasant things that were being said, just the fact of having something that's so intimate, like someone's honeymoon, that mattered a lot to someone that you were very close to, and that this person would have liked to have those photos, was extremely devastated that she never had any memory of her life pretty much before communism. I mean, everything was destroyed. She didn't have anything that could connect her to this life before communism because everything was taken. And she always used this sentence. She said, we lost everything. Everything was taken from us. And so everything she told me was using her memory and her imagination. And so there was a sense that not only this was somehow in the wrong hands and in the wrong place, but that there was a betrayal of this person that would have actually liked to instead have a relative or a granddaughter. I was very close to my grandmother. Instead, have those photos and be able to cherish them and to reflect on them. So that was one part of it, was just about, who is this question of photos are relevant because they're memories in a way. It's not about the object itself, it's about what they capture. And so why is this life somehow in the wrong hands, and how can I do something to, how can I recover, or how can I do justice to this person that can no longer do justice to herself, since it seems to be possible. I mean, one thing is if you think of it as a catastrophic loss and irremediable loss that you can't do anything about, but then suddenly the photo is there on Facebook and clearly someone has had it in their hands and has clearly seen it and is now using it to share. And so you have this sense of protection immediately. And then the second one, and this is perhaps even, see, this was more frightening, I think, was this idea that suddenly it dawned on me after reading these comments that maybe I didn't know anything about my grandmother, that maybe these people knew something that, once you open the files and once you think about the archives and what these documents from former surveillance authorities contain, often families find very, very unpleasant things about their relatives. So you go there thinking my grandmother was a victim, and then what you discover is, for example, that she might have been a collaborator and that she did exactly the same thing to other people that she claims was done to her. And so suddenly everything is reversed about your family. And again, there was a question of, okay, maybe I can only restore dignity if I find the truth. So if I access these files, this question of dignity became embedded and connected to this question of knowing what happened and knowing the facts and knowing what is being told, with some sense also that perhaps you don't find the person's dignity, because you might actually discover that the person is not at all what you knew and how you thought they were. You discover a completely different life, and not necessarily a pleasant one, but maybe there is a sense in which this triggers a process that is somehow cathartic for future generations, in this case myself, or for this just process of understanding historical injustice in all its complexity. And so it moved away, I think, especially in the second stage, when it was no longer just about my grandmother, but it became a reflection on how do you deal with this. You're about to go to these archives. I remember when the first email came from these Secret Service authorities that were giving me the appointment, I was told that there was a file under my father's name which had 600 pages, and my father was never in prison. So you think, well, 600 pages under my father's name, this can only have been a spy. And it was really interesting also to see how the family relatives were reacting to this. My mom was like, oh, why do you want to go there? Why do you want to find out? It's like this for everyone. So there was a sense in which you just don't want to open this. And for me, instead, it was very important to actually be able to open it, but with a complete awareness that what you find is not necessarily pleasant, and from a personal perspective, and that instead might become more important from a different perspective as not just a personal one.
I don't want to give away, there is a twist in this story. I think people should read it. It's definitely worth reading it and finding out what the twist is. But at the very end of the book, almost in the last paragraph, when you reflect on what it means, it doesn't feel cathartic, I have to say. It's a bit bleak, actually. You try and find something. I can almost feel you sort of straining to find something which restores your faith. We've talked in the past on this podcast about how important faith is for politics and thinking about the future. But this reader, me, thought that you were struggling with that. It feels quite bleak. I don't think by the end of the book, it's a completely fascinating story, and we'll talk about how you reconstruct it, because you go back a long way in the prehistory of that photograph. But the one thing I didn't feel is that it was cathartic for you.
Well, I think it was cathartic almost by telling yourself that it will be cathartic through the method rather than because of the findings. So I don't think the findings were cathartic. In fact, the whole process, the whole journey was a very bleak journey, because what happened was the more I went thinking that I was finding details about my grandmother's life and reading these documents, and not just in the Albanian Secret Service archives, I did a lot of research in a lot of other archives in other countries as well, because I began to piece together the history from very early on. Maybe we'll get to that. But in every single archive, I was extremely disenchanted thinking as someone who had only used archives for very, very limited purposes before and hadn't really done what something that historians are very familiar with, which is what the archive doesn't tell you is sometimes as important as what it does tell you. So the silence of the archive is sometimes louder than the information that you can kind of gather from it. And so in that sense, it was bleak because it started with the desire and an aspiration to find the truth in history with the method of the historian, which is to go to the sources and to find the archives. And then the more the book research progressed, the more I thought that this is a very limited perspective. And in fact, history is not going to give me what I want, not just because, and this is why it's connected to this question of dignity, not just because it doesn't give me the facts, but because even the facts that I find are always going to be interpreted by some authority or other. They're always going to be manipulated or used for ideological purposes, or, the story being pieced together, the story that I'm given, that I'm being served in the archive, is always being pieced together by some authority or other. And unless my motives are completely aligned with the motives of that authority, if you're hyper aware of this gap between, what they want you to know and to believe and what you actually think you should know and you should believe, going back to this Kantian question that we were raising in one of the previous episodes, it becomes extremely disorienting and disenchanting. And you actually really do lose faith with these historical processes and with what you can gather from historical documents. So in the end, I think I say that it's cathartic because I actually found the catharsis in the process of trying to imagine and reimagine, and in this interpretive effort that I put as a researcher and as a writer into reading the story in a certain way and putting together in a certain way. And so in the end, I think this is why the epigraphs are Kant and Schiller, because there was this huge discussion between Kant and Schiller on, how you can find reconciliation in a very polarized, in a divided world, in a world that is very kind of disenchanted, that, as Schiller says, has lost the gods and has lost the unity of nature, as he puts it, but hasn't found the unity of freedom or the unity of history, because there is no reconciliation in the world that we know. It's an extremely tragic process that we're constantly subjected to. But Schiller says, maybe there is hope in the kind of power of the artist or of the writer to reflect on this and to reconstruct this and in this kind of creative process itself. And so if I were to kind of single out which bit of this whole journey were the ones that I felt were cathartic, it wasn't the ones that I discovered by reading the archives. It was the ones where actually I was exercising my own imagination and trying to put these things together and imagine these characters and these lives, and indeed also use the characters as ways of talking about dignity and different conceptions of dignity.
And you do it, most of the book, not all of the book, some of the book is what you found in the archives. We get some of those documents. Some of it is your story of going to the archives, and it's, it's bleak, but it's also quite funny as well. There's humor and bleakness always. But most of the book is the imaginative reconstruction, and it is the imaginative reconstruction of not just your grandmother's life, but her parents' life. And actually it starts with her grandparents, right? Actually, the imaginative reconstruction begins with the death of her grandfather. And I mentioned this when we were talking about Stoicism and Kantianism and the dignity or indignity of death, because that's where you start. You start with the question of what is a dignified or an undignified death. And as I was rereading the book after we spoke, I realized there are actually a lot of deaths in this book. I don't want to make it sound too bleak. It is harrowing in places, but it's also funny in places. But there are a lot of deaths. And in a way, actually, maybe I was over-interpreting it, but as I was rereading it, each death is a meditation on the question of dignity in death. There are different kinds of death. Some of them are frightening and undignified people being hounded to their deaths in various ways. Some of them are almost comic. But in each case, the question is raised, was that a good death? I have to say, I hadn't noticed that the first time I was reading it. It was only after we spoke. Is that right, that that's one of the meditations on dignity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you picked it up because it was completely intentional. And so each of these deaths is there as also as a way of revealing a certain way of thinking about dignity in connection to death, but also in particular in connection to the question of dignity. And in many ways, it's also an effort to revisit, just as I had done with free and freedom. Here, my kind of core concept was dignity. And so many of the characters and many of the stories and the episodes are there to exemplify a certain way of thinking about dignity. And so, for example, just to talk about this first chapter where it starts with my grandmother's both birth, which coincides with her grandfather's death, And he was a pasha, and the thing that I had always, and this is a true story, by the way, the thing that I'd always been told about this pasha was that he died in a very ridiculous way, and he overate too much. He ate too much baklava, and the Turkish very sweet stuff. And he ate too much baklava because he was told that when my grandmother was born, he had a grandson, and he wanted to have a grandson, not a granddaughter. And so he'd been somehow misinformed, and so was so happy that went and ate a lot of baklava, and then died from overeating baklava. And then there was this whole story about how can someone who's had this honorable, glorious life, this goes back to this question of Cicero and standing, and the Roman conception of dignity as status and standing. So this man who, if you see the photos, is a very stern, very dignified character, was a high administrator of the Ottoman Empire, had brokered a lot of peace deals with, the Austro-Hungarians in the Balkans, had been in this very typical kind of elite Ottoman character. And there he is, he's dying, he's dead. And the book starts with this scene of his death, which is actually the most ridiculous death you can think of, but also the scene of this dead person. It's not pleasant. He's not there surrounded with flowers and people. He's surrounded by a kind of panicking wife and servants who are saying, this pasha cannot possibly conclude this life in this way. And, how you die is almost a way of epitomizing how you've lived. And so if you have this very ridiculous death, then it almost casts a shadow on your entire life and your whole achievements. And so it was very, very important to her grandmother, so my great-grandmother, that her husband also has a dignified death. And that's where the book all starts, with this story of how to turn this death from being a ridiculous death to being a serious one. And then, as you say, I don't want to spoil too much of the plot, but there's other deaths, and some of them are, one of them in particular is a very kind of stoic death. And indeed, it's used as a paradigm of the stoic suicide, because it's there to suggest that this is how the Stoics thought about the relationship between nature and freedom, and that there is a way of kind of emerging or liberating yourself from the constraints of a life that you don't want by just killing yourself, and so by just exiting. And the whole chapter is a reflection actually on Stoic suicide, including this metaphor that the Stoics had, which was that when a room is full of smoke and you're choking, what do? You leave. And for them, this was a metaphor for the world is this room full of smoke and you're choking, and so when that happens, you kill yourself. And then I made that the center of an entire way of talking about my grandmother's youth, her connections to her family, this particular time that she spent in Salonika, which was a very important imperial center at the point in which she was born, and then completely begins to change with the changes of the 20th century. And that raises other questions about dignity that we might also get to.
With the death of her grandfather, you describe her grandmother saying to the doctor, it can't be this, please let it not be the stomach. In the end, he reluctantly agrees to call it a heart attack, and she says, thank God, there's dignity in that, which is interesting in itself. But I also noticed, looking at it again, because it does touch on what we talk about, one of the things you have him do is try and persuade her it's not undignified by telling that ancient Roman story from Livy about how the stomach is the seat of the body and all the other bits of the body depend on it, which weirdly, that is the speech from Coriolanus in which it's used. And the thing that it is applied to is the Roman Senate. So in that version, the most dignified of all the institutions of Rome, the Senate, in Coriolanus. And it's a joke, actually, in Coriolanus. I think it's meant to be completely ironic. Menenius tries to persuade the plebs that though the Senate is the stomach of the body politic, that is appropriate because the stomach is so important. And basically, they laugh him out of court. And so these things do all connect. It is part of that Roman story of trying to find dignity in something that actually, frankly, when you look at it from the wrong angle, isn't dignified.
That was all intentional. So Coriolanus was all in the back of my mind when I was writing this, and this whole stuff about the stomach and the fact that all the organs are connected. And the other thing that's also important, the Pasha is a symbol of a declining empire. And, the Ottoman Empire was a sick man of Europe and was referred to as the sick man of Europe. And so there you have this sick man who is now actually dead, and dead in this very ridiculous way, not a heroic way, not in battle, not in any way that you can actually glorify. There's no glory in that kind of death. It's a solitary death surrounded by your wife and servants and a doctor. And of course, a doctor who says that, that theme of how you die is actually really important throughout the book, because actually this doctor, who is a Jewish doctor and is also there as a character, it's really important because it's to talk about the Sephardi Jews of Salonika, who were the largest group in the city up to the beginning of World War II. And this story of how you die was also really important to a debate that was going on in Salonika throughout the 20s and 30s about the Jewish cemetery. and the memory of Jewish graves and this context between the new emerging nationalist Greek state and this community that wanted to actually protect its dead by preserving the historic memory and preserving the graves. And so there's this whole debate in the interwar period about what happens to the cemetery of Salonika, which eventually gets completely destroyed by the Nazis when they take over the city in the 1940s. But the debate about the graves and the question of do the living have more dignity than the dead had actually been preceding the Nazi destruction. So this was a debate that was going on throughout the 30s. And interestingly, it was also a debate about dignity, because one of the concerns was that, the Greek authorities who had taken over the city, it was in the process of being Hellenized. As I say, it was an Ottoman city, but then becomes a kind of Greek, more and more a Greek nationalist city. The authorities were saying, well, we need the space of the cemetery for the universities, and we need space for research, and we need space for scientific labs. And on the other hand, you had the Jewish community who wanted to keep the territory of the cemetery and was saying, well, why can't you have the land somewhere else? And this is, of course, coupled with 1930s anti-Semitism and waves of anti-Jewish sentiment in all of these centers. But what's really important that there is also gets phrased as a question about dignity. So do these potential beneficiaries of scientific research by the university have more claim than the dead people who are, there buried, and it doesn't really matter, the risk that these labs pose if they don't have enough space is much more than what is protected by protecting the memory of the dead. And so there's this whole debate throughout the book that comes back also throughout and gets resolved in ways that, again, I don't want to spoil. But this question of how you die is constantly phrased and constantly raised in terms of, is it connected? How we die, does it matter how we die? And is it connected to how we live?
And that's a false choice, right, isn't it? Because the dead are also the living. It's like the question of the cemetery is not just about the dignity of the dead. It's about the dignity, the rights, the value of the people who want to remember the dead in the place where they buried them. I mean, it seems like you can't just make it the dead versus the living, because, and it is a theme of the book, the dead are living in the minds and memories of the living.
Absolutely. And also, this is also the meaning making, group rights and culture rights, right? So it's obviously, if you frame it in this purely utilitarian, self-interest maximizing of the living terms, then this is the form that debate took, which was, well, we need space for lab, we need space for research. And so forget about culture and forget about these group rights and so on. But of course, to be able to understand who you are and to make sense of your own identity, all of these, the cemetery, the history, the community, the sites of protection are also really important elements. If you erase that, you're right, you're not just destroying the dead, you're destroying the living, because you're preventing them from making sense of who they are and of exerting their own autonomy, and so posing their ends in this very Kantian way in the world in which they live.
The book begins that the death of your grandmother's grandfather, that's in Constantinople, but then it moves to Salonika, as you say, which is where your grandmother was born. Salonika, this melting pot city, being Hellenized, but with all of these different communities living in it. And you describe that world. You also describe the political pressures, then the movements of people, the resettlements of people. And you do it through very colourful descriptions of characters and language in which animals and weather and colour, the scenery plays a part.
One of the themes that I really wanted to capture, and in part this is about the changes to daily life of the collapse of empires. So it was at the beginning of it for me. You can tell the story of the book at many levels. You can talk about it as a kind of philosophical book about dignity, or you can talk about it as a historical book about the collapse of empire and the rise of these nation states in the Balkans, and in many ways also the rise of fascism in the 1930s and the politics of the 30s, and also how similar some of it is to actually what we are experiencing now. But also what was really important to me, and that's partly why the choice of using this literary style to capture some of it, is also how the collapse of these big systems and abstract concepts that we associate to them is actually really visible in the everyday lives of individuals who live under these systems. And the reason why it starts, so the first chapter is about the Pasha and the death of the Pasha and the collapse of the empire in many ways. The second chapter is about the population exchange between Greece and Turkey as part of the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And this was the kind of last treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, which kind of marked the official end of World War I between states, and which culminates with the decision to move peoples from one place to another. And so in the case of the Greeks of Salonika and the Turks and the different minorities, the idea was that the Greeks of Turkey and Asia Minor in particular would come back to Greece, and the Turks of Greece would return to Turkey. And interestingly, Albanians, which were in the middle of all this, and many of them had been part of the Ottoman elite and were part of these kind of Ottoman elite families, there was a little bit more leeway. And so one of the things that was really haunting my grandmother when I remembered speaking to her about this whole thing was that if they had said that they were Turks instead of saying that they wanted to stay in Greece because they had a little bit more choice, and so there were various subcommittees to which they were invited to testify and say what they were, what their identity was, and depending on what they said they were, they could end up in one country or another. And she always said that the part of her family that had taken advantage of the Lausanne Treaty and went to Turkey had a great life, and the part of the family that stayed in Greece and eventually ended up, as she did, in Albania, then had a horrible life because they were caught by communism, the First World War II, and then communism, and then most of them were ended up in prison or persecuted or killed and executed and so on. So, this decision that was taken in the context of the Lausanne Treaty, the stakes of which even they didn't really understand. They thought it was all about property. Where was it likely? Because as part of this process, also the properties were being converted. So, if you went and you had a piece of land in Greece, then you would say to the authorities what that land was, and you'd get an equivalent amount in Turkey. And there was this whole thing about how the Turks were being more generous than the Greeks and all this kind of disputes. And I remember from a very, very young age being told a lot about this population exchange. And in my mind, even then, even now, it's kind of hard to understand what a population exchange is, right? Because it's just such a strange concept that you have a collective of hundreds of thousands of people suddenly being asked to move and forced to move by a deadline. And of course, now I hear about these plans, of creating humanitarian cities in the Middle East and forced displacement of people. And it's eerie how much reminiscent it is of actually that world. And often the discourse that justifies it as well, that they will be protected or they'll be safer if they move to this area. And it was exactly what people were saying about the population exchange, that the Greeks in Asia Minor could never be safe because there was a genocide against the other non-Turkish minorities and there had been a war, and so they could never be safe. The only way to guarantee their safety was to just actually make sure in this regulated from the top way that they moved to Greece. And this really, my grandmother spoke about this whole life for many reasons, because it had kind of changed her life, but also I remember I was just captured by this idea of what is a population exchange? How does it work? I just couldn't get my head around it. And there was something that I wanted with the book to capture, because, as I say, it came framed with these ideas of dignity and the collective and how you live a dignified life and how you can only have a dignified life if you now move. But of course, these people had all had lives before the collapse of empire. These were all in their communities, and so they were completely uprooted. And there's various characters in the book. I tell the story of her maid, for example, who was forced to go back to Turkey because she was Turk, and what impact that has on individuals and on their choices.
There's another version of that. You talk about your grandmother's other moment of regret, which is sort of like the micro-personal version. At the end of the Second World War, as the Nazi occupation is collapsing, and a German man who features in the book, very interesting character. We'll talk about him in a second. But he basically wants her to get out. But she's married by that point. Your father has been born. But you suggest that, as it were, in her life, there are these moments where a whole life turns on the decision made in minutes, I'm guessing, or hours. And it happened actually more than twice, but those are the two where it's about, do you stay or do you go? Do you go this side of the border or that side of the border? And in both cases, she stayed.
Yes, and especially, with the second case, the stakes. So the first case, she went to Albania, and of course, people who stayed in Albania or went to Albania didn't have such a great life, even if they didn't end up in prison. Although most people from these families who were Ottoman imperial elite families did all have a terrible fortunes after with the arrival of communism, because they were part of the Ottoman elite, and so they were the ruling elites that just had to be fought. But even without that, she was responsible for rightly, I think, causally responsible for the fact that my grandfather, very quickly after she decided to decline this offer, was arrested and put to prison. And so this was another thing. And this clearly, I had the impression when I've revisiting the family history, I never knew my grandfather. He died when I was very young, so I never had conversations with him about this. But my mom said that when she had conversations with him and said, this wife, because many wives of political prisoners would divorce their husbands in Albania. And she always said to him, this wife, she was amazing. She was so virtuous. She followed you for 15 years. She brought up this child, my father, by herself. And she followed you in all these prisons. They were terrible, these prisons. And he only once said to her, yes, but if she had not insisted, we would not have been in Albania. So somehow there was this regret, and clearly had been a very fraught moment within the couple, which otherwise you idealize and you think of as your grandparents as this happy couple that had solidarity in hardship. And clearly there was this kind of of original sin where they had thought, well, if she had decided to move and had not decided to stay to Albania, actually he would have been a lawyer in the US, he said, or in Paris or whatever. He had a degree from the Sorbonne, and yeah, he could have had a very good life anywhere else instead of having these 15 years in prison that were all hanging on this one decision that was made in the circumstances that you described.
And there's another haunting moment. It's almost the most haunting moment in the book where the personal, the super micro collides with the much bigger political story. Before your grandparents were married, you describe, you reimagine, and then you also say that in her version of it, actually, her memory of this was not reliable at all, and she jumbled these stories up, and it's not clear that she remembered this incident, certainly the timing of it, but that she was in a cafe with the man that she would marry, and then another man who was known to her future husband came in and sat down, and they started arguing about politics. And she was just somehow repulsed by him, and you describe it in the language of smell. So his breath smelt of onions, but he covered it up with the smell of lavender. And she moved her chair away from him. She just turned away from him. And it's an instinctive moment of revulsion. And you carry on describing the scene, and then it's only at the end that we discovered that this young man, this uppity student, pretentious, but also in his way already seemingly knowing where he's going, is called Enver Hoxha, the man who would rule and indeed tyrannize Albania for 40 years and would jail the man he was talking to. And there's a bit that I assume you've sort of reimagined this, but there's a suggestion that your grandmother felt that the moment where she moved her chair was also a pivot in her life.
Yeah, also because she felt that there was, I mean, again, it's one of these things with what is this raises the question of what is memory and how do people remember and what they remember. And it's known that there is selective memory and that often trauma contributes to making memory selective in exactly the ways that are connected to trauma. And for her, of course, the trauma was a trauma of communism and of this man coming to power, and already it being clear during the war that he had a project and that this project was very different from my grandfather, who was a more sort of standard social democrat. He was a communist and had very clear views about what power is and how it should be exercised, and those views and indeed also dignity and how that is connected to power. And all of those things somehow they had known always. But of course, they hadn't completely known that, because if they had completely known that, they wouldn't turn down the decision of moving away from Albania. So they could both see and not see it. But what is important is that then after, when she recollected these early encounters with this man, she always singled out these moments before as though they were anticipatory, as though there was a very clear connection between that moment and what happened after and the decision to arrest my grandfather and send him to prison. And this, again, is one of these questions that when we remember selectively, often the past is made by our understanding of what followed from that, as opposed to what we remember and what is in the past. So often the past is shaped by the present, and memory is selective because it's the present and your effort to understand where you are now and to make sense of your life in the present that then contributes to also reading the past in a certain way and to interpreting in a certain way. So I think she always thought of this moment as a pivotal moment where, she even thought that he hated her because somehow she responded in the wrong way and she hadn't been friendly enough. And maybe, people, when you have regrets, then everything go, and I know with experiences of just dealing with loss sometimes, that you always try to find out how you had contributed to the loss. Your mind is always trying to work out where you could have done something different that would have produced a different result. And this was one of the cases where these minutiae of the encounters contributed in her mind to thinking that maybe the outcome of the whole thing would have been very different if she had just, been a bit friendlier or had been nicer. And this, of course, it's an illusion, but it's really interesting that the mind sort of plays these tricks.
But it's the horror, it's the indignity of being subject to absolute arbitrary rule. And this is a story that goes all the way back to people thinking about what it means to be a slave or what it means to be subject to arbitrary power, which is you don't know what is the thing that is going to trigger the person who eventually has control over you and that person's contempt or rage or murderous desires. And it could be something as trivial as moving your chair back because you don't like the smell. And that is part of the horror of it. That is the horror and indignity of being subject to that kind of rule.
It's really interesting because, again, it's connected to this question of why you remember selectively. because what you remember in this way is the effort, or what you're trying to do by remembering in this way is to ascribe agency to yourself in those circumstances. So this idea that if you had done something different, if you had exercised your will in a different way, then this, as you say, completely arbitrary situation in which you're at the mercy of power might have turned out very differently. And so you're trying to reverse the process and to take the whole responsibility chain back to yourself. And especially in her case, I think it was always important to emphasize agency, because she had this idea of freedom, which I also happen to have, that is connected to moral responsibility and to moral agency. And the biggest threat to that idea is this feeling that actually there isn't very much that the agent can do, because the agent is always just a cog in a machine, and then the machine keeps kind of spinning its wheels and you're just there and you don't really know what's being done to you. And it's a terrible, terrible thought for someone who actually wants to think of the future as something that we have agency on. And that's why I think when you then think about the past, you're always, while acknowledging that there is arbitrariness and there is power, you're also trying to single out moments where you actually have exercised some agency, however trivial in this case, obviously.
One of the other themes that comes out of that part of the book, the Second World War and its immediate aftermath, if I had to sum it up, it would be don't trust the British. I don't know if you think that's a fair summary of it, but there are a small number of British characters who enter this because Churchill and others in Britain sent various people to the Balkans, including to Albania, to continue the fight against the Nazis and to support partisan resistance. And both your grandparents got involved with a couple of those people. But the sense one gets is that that was a mistake too, because those people were not to be trusted. Those people didn't actually have any real understanding of what it was they would be leaving behind once they'd come in, done their kind of glory hunting Second World War, Secret Service stuff, and then got out again. The British characters don't come out of your book well.
Well, I mean, they are directly responsible for my grandfather ending up in prison. So, talking about agency, this was one thing that came out in the files very, very clearly, and on which there seemed to be absolutely no ambiguity, that the names of these SOE officers that he had been in touch during the war and briefly after were the reason he was, and his official charge was condemned for agitation and propaganda and collaboration with British officers and British intelligence forces. So, he was hanging out with these characters, and they were trying to encourage a resistance movement that was not. So this part of the story historically, and then we can kind of talk about the resemblances to the present, I think. This part of the story is really interesting because they were sent there to encourage whoever was fighting the fascists. And the communists, of course, were fighting the fascists along with other forces, but the Brits played a huge role in supporting the Communist Party. They gave them weapons, they gave them intelligence information, they gave them clothes, they gave them food. So they had a really important role in actually consolidating the communist movement in Albania that was very, very small. It wasn't like Yugoslavia or like the Soviet Union where you had a strong interwar communist force, and then in the war it gets even more consolidated. In Albania that was not the case. There was a kind of broad progressive movement, but it was a semi-feudal society with semi-feudal structures, very few capitalist development, and therefore very few working classes and proletariats. And so none of the agents that would support the communist movement elsewhere were there. And indeed, it was more the war that strengthened the communists, and the Brits played a huge role. Now, of course, this was for part of the war, but then by the end, they realized that they were being played by Hoxha, so that, Hoxha was kind of taking help from wherever he could take it, both for his own project of supporting and increasing strength and support for his party, and he was taking help from the Soviets, from the Yugoslavs, from the Brits, from wherever we could take it. And then at the end, he decided to just get rid of them and say, well, they can't be trusted. And the Brits were very worried. And so this is where my grandfather's story becomes really important, because then they begin to try to support alternative left-wing or progressive anti-fascists. It was very hard to find people who were both against Hitler and Mussolini and who had not been fascist before the war to then support for the post-war reconstruction. So they were trying to find these very few, very naive characters like my grandfather, who were social democrats, honest, had always been anti-fascist, to support. And that's why they then ended up in prison, because when there was the purge against the social democrats, they were accused of having collaborated with the Brits. So the Brits don't come out well. But the story, I think, is not that different from how the great powers operate in all of the small countries that they go and try to fix kind of civil conflicts for the sake of a larger kind of geopolitical goal. And indeed, I thought a lot about this when Afghanistan was being left to the Taliban a few years ago, and the Western forces and NATO and so all this kind of military support that the West had put in place, suddenly they all left. And of course, all the people who had supported them in Afghanistan were left to be killed or persecuted by the Taliban. And who took responsibility for that? Well, this is just a standard story. You go there, you're a great power, you go there, you make a mess, don't really know exactly what's going on, don't necessarily speak the language. You get some kind of 2-week training course somewhere, as these British officers had received in Cairo by some British anthropologist who had been to Albania in the interwar and so on. And then with very little information and very little awareness and actually very little ethics of responsibility for the way in which you're supporting. And then when you decide to cut the support, I sometimes think the same with Ukraine. And, when the West will decide to actually no longer support Ukraine, or if they will decide to continue supporting it, what's going to happen to these people? But all of these decisions are made in a very rushed way. And unfortunately, they impact small nations in catastrophic ways that to the great powers just doesn't matter. So, yeah, the Brits don't come out well, but I think they're not unique in that. It's a very standard pattern as I see it.
Yeah, and they don't come well out of the Afghanistan story either. I mean, that's been in the newspapers recently too. I want to go back to the epigraphs. Schiller, but Kant. The line from Kant is the one that we talked about. I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm sure there are lots of different translations of it, but basically it's the line that says things either have a price or they have a dignity. And one of the themes in the book is people putting a price on things that you might think ought to be treated as though they had dignity. So this includes, there are various points, and again, I'm sure this is deliberate. You can tell me if it's not, but when people put a price on books and reading and the cost of reading, and you have lots of interesting variations on that theme, including the question of whether there was less anti-Semitism in Albania because Albania was an illiterate population, so there was no price to be paid by reading because you couldn't read the propaganda. But also a price put on law. So there's a very memorable scene in which your grandparents meet, actually, I think, for the first time in a law clerk's office where the law is for sale. I mean, it's essentially for sale. So that's also, there's that other story running through it, the more cynical story, which is everything has a price.
Yeah, in part, I think because there I wanted to tell the story of authorities in particular, claiming to subscribe to this very ideal notion of dignity and very kind of purified and very moralistic. But then actually what they do is they manipulate it and they put it for sale, as you say. And they just, this notion that, the dignity of the state is now in this clerk's office who has to do certain things and who is putting a price on them and then is telling how the world works and how institutions operate now, because it's all about this new state that has just emerged and needs to do certain things to be dignified among other states. This was, again, I think in part intentional because I wanted to talk about nationalism and the nation state as what we now think of as the site of collective dignity, but also in this very disenchanted Marxist perspective. Actually, what it is just elites deciding that this is what dignity, this is what's going to be called dignity, and presenting that. And of course, for me, again, this is a very troubling, and sometimes literature is for me also a way of kind of working out philosophical problems by myself, but it's a very troubling outlook because it gives you an account of institutions, which is not how we think of institutions now. We think of nations, of the state as connected to patriotism, to this site of kind of collective identification that provides greater value than the sum of its parts and so on. But of course, there's also a much more cynical story of power and what the state does and how it operates and how it then purchases loyalty or buys and sells off loyalty in these ways. And I think that was what I wanted to problematize in thinking about the different ways of talking about dignity. So one is an individual level, interpersonal, moral agents in their personal relations. But the other level of talking about dignity is institutional, and it has to do with how authorities conceptualize and articulate their own understanding of dignity and what the role of the law is in doing that, and then everything that comes with backing up the law with, because the law by itself never works. So you also need ways of stabilizing the law, which is culture and nationalism and myths and storytelling, and the way in which all of that is also often framed for us, and we don't necessarily choose it authentically, but suddenly there we are. We have to have a civil code, and the way you get the civil code is in Albania by copying it from Ataturk, who then has in turn copied it from the Swiss, and so it all goes back to the great powers in the end. But in these ways that I think also tell a story about authority and its relationship to dignity. And I think all those episodes and all those vignettes are there for that reason.
And at one point, I can't remember which of the characters, one of the more cynical ones, maybe it's Gustav the German, but someone warns your grandmother not to trust in that worthless constitution. That's the phrase I remember, the worthless constitution. And we talked about this, right? At this point in European history, all of these constitutions, all across the continent, East and West, they all have learnt the language of dignity and rights. But your grandmother is being warned that words are meaningless in this context.
The bit about the Constitution actually is in a chapter where I have my grandfather speak to his father, who is the kind of collaborator prime minister. And so you have a socialist son confronting a fascist father. And the fascist father is making this very cynical argument that, you're a small country, you don't make your own history. History is just done to you by the great powers. And so you just have to see which way the wind blows, and then you go with wherever the great powers are taking you, just so that you can survive. Otherwise, you kind of get wiped out. And so he makes this very positivistic argument about the law. He says, well, I'm there, I have to support the constitution. And of course, it's a collaborationist constitution. So at this point, Albania is part of the kingdom of the Victor Emmanuel kingdom. It's the kingdom of Italy and Albania. But he's the one who is in charge of this constitution that represents this union. And the son, who is an idealistic and also a lawyer, but thinks of the law very differently, says, well, you call that piece of rubbish a constitution. And this is, in his case, trying to distinguish between the law with the kind of capital L and the moralized law, as we were saying when we were talking about, the legal and political meanings of dignity, that you have this kind of moral legal conception and then a completely anti-moral or non-moral or amoral conception of the law that is just like whatever authority has decided to call the law, you're the institution or you're the bureaucrat, you're the official in charge of it. So your job is to apply the law, and you don't ask yourself questions around its worth and its value. And especially in a context like Albania, you just have no agency anyway. So even if you were to ask yourself these questions, it wouldn't matter. I mean, there is another character in the book who, for me, was the hardest to write and raised the most questions in terms of pushing me to question my own conception of dignity, and that is Gustav. That's the kind of Nazi character. And where I actually found also that using literature to write character is really productive, because it makes you think like the character that you're trying to write, and therefore you somehow have to force yourself to identify with the character and therefore with their view of dignity, which he's he's introduced early on as saying he likes to read the genealogy of morals. And there is a chapter in which he confronts my grandmother. He's the one who makes the offer to leave Albania, and confronts my grandmother with his view of morality by making her an offer that she thinks is somehow a way of, because of things he has done in the past to the family, of redeeming himself. And so she says, well, are you feeling guilty? And he's a Nietzschean, so he doesn't recognize guilt as a moral category, and actually doesn't think about morality in any way that recognizes these familiar concepts that we have, regret or, doing the right thing or having a moral conscience, as in any way meaningful. I mean, for him, they're just like wordplay, basically. And I think when I was writing the book, that's the question that I was constantly confronted with, is this Nietzschean take on dignity, which is that this is just slave morality, and it's just the losers who become winners, and then because of their resentment, decide to now adopt these categories. And, Nietzsche connects it to the critique of Christianity and then to the critique of the Enlightenment. And of course, his direct target was Kant. But the way he unpacks that conversation around dignity, I think is really powerful. And it's just very, very hard to resist from a philosophical perspective. Actually, I found the more I read it and the more not that I'm sympathetic to it, but I almost have to be unsympathetic by an act of will. There's a jump at some point, and it's almost like a leap of faith. Which way do you jump? Do you jump the Nietzschean way or do you jump the Kantian way?
It's interesting. So I misremembered it. So I remember the phrase, that worthless constitution. And you say, actually, it's the idealistic son rebuking the fascist father. And I misremembered it as Gustav, the Nietzschean Nazi, warning your grandmother not to put her trust in these so-called values. Almost I remembered it as the opposite of the thing that you described. And yet these are just two sides of the same coin, in a way. It could go either way. It could be the Nietzschean Nazi nihilist warning off someone who's put their faith in words, or it could be the idealist warning off the fascist who thinks our constitution is dignified because I'm standing up for it.
Yeah, but I think there is a difference between them, because the one who is rejecting the fascist constitution does not reject the idea of a morality or of a moral constitution. So he's just rejecting this particular constitution that he thinks is immoral. And in other circumstances, in a better society, the constitution would really track the moral will, let's say, to just go back to the conversation we were having around Kant and how, this project of the kingdom of ends becomes an institutional and a political project. So that my grandfather, he's in many ways an honest social democrat, and he believes in actually a law that needs to track morality. It's just that he thinks the fascist constitution doesn't track morality, but that's a problem with the fascist constitution, not with the morality of the constitution as a whole. Whereas Gustav, who I think pushes this line even further in a kind of subsequent chapter, is the one who really unpacks and kind of articulates, well, what is morality? Where does it come from? And there's this chapter that's called Lambs and Eagles, because Nietzsche actually uses the term birds of prey and lambs when he talks about this. And he has this extremely powerful metaphor in the genealogy of morals where he says, at some point the lambs are going to be taken away, but that's not the problem. What can the birds of prey do? The lambs can't really complain that the birds of prey are taking them. This is what it takes to have power and to do it. And when the lambs themselves become redeemed, they will become the birds of prey. And so Gustav is using this to talk about the communists and, to articulate this idea of power and in connection to morality and to dignity. But I found that whole chapter really disturbing to write because, as I say, I was putting in him words that I never would like to have told to myself in a seminar when I'm talking about Kant. It's like, I think one of the most strong criticisms that you could have against this conception of the kingdom of ends and of morality and so on, and just very hard to resist.
And when I say two sides of the same coin, I suppose what I mean is that you can turn the coin round and get the opposite argument, but it looks and sounds familiar, but it turns it on its head very quickly. It happens very quickly. All of this happens very, very quickly. And the experience of your grandfather, the inversion of his view of politics and morality, happens incredibly quickly.
No, absolutely. And of course, in the world that we know, every set of ideals eventually ends up, distorted and manipulated in a way that proves the Nietzscheans right. But the question is, if you have that thought, if that's what the fundamental is, that the ultimate truth that you believe in, then it's really hard to have hope and faith in progress and in the future and think that there's anything that we can learn from history or that we can do better next time and so on. It's such a bleak conception in its kind of nihilism that I just don't think it cannot be productive for social and political purposes. I can see how, it's important reflexively, and it's important that it's part of art and that we're constantly aware of it, also to challenge our own self-confidence and our own faith and our own belief in these ideas of progress. But I don't think you can go very far with it in the end, because it's just completely paralyzing of, any notion of incremental progress or any sense that we can actually, generations learn from one another or institutions get a little bit better over time. And I mean, there are also things that we can say for progress. There are things that we can do, that we have done also from a legal perspective. We rule out slavery, or the constitutions can also entrench certain norms that are repositories of moral learning, I think. And it's really important that they do that. And if you have the Nietzschean view, you can't see how it changes from one time to the other. So the fascist constitution, the communist constitution, the liberal constitution, they're just all the same. They're all the powerful, however many people manage to convince however many other people. And it's just elites kind of reproducing this. And I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but I just find it very...
So I'm not saying Gustav is right, but I'm just saying it's striking in your telling of it, how Gustav's perspective on this can appear almost at any time, in any place, and it can, among other things, as you just said, he's the man who makes the offer that your grandmother regretted not taking for the rest of her life.
And also he resists the definition of the offer as a moral offer. So that's what's really interesting, right? He has this is why, I mean, this was partly me reinterpreting and reimagining this in a way that would also rescue his humanity. So he shows some humanity, he shows some concern for restoring something or redeeming an injustice or acting in a way that can help someone, some regret, but he will not acknowledge, because he's so consistent and so coherent, he will not acknowledge that this reveals anything about morality in doing that. So he will refuse that offer being categorized as a moral offer.
And you could say, therefore, it was your grandmother who made the category mistake, because she tried to interpret it as a moral offer. And maybe if she'd seen it in starker terms, she might have chosen differently.
Yeah, but that was me wanting her to be right in reading it as a moral offer, because that's my Kantianism trying to say, actually, the categorical imperative is there and is sort of whispering even to Gustav, even though he will not acknowledge that that is the categorical imperative. So that's what the Kantian cannot give up, this notion that we have a moral conscience. And even if we deny that we have a moral conscience, actually sometimes the moral conscience tells you this is just wrong and I'm going to do something about it. And sometimes it makes you reflect on the past, or in his case it comes with, he says it was my birthday and I have been thinking about my life and the things that I have done throughout my life and the things that he had done to the family that's connected to this kind of earlier parts of the book. But yeah, it's absolutely how you read that chapter. And it's very open because I don't want to resolve it for readers. I read it as her saying that there is a moral offer here. But of course, there's another very equally plausible reading, which is to say that it was my grandmother who was wrong.
So that leads to the last thing I want to ask you, because as you just mentioned there, your grandfather was the son of the prime minister who was the prime minister under the brief Mussolini-based fascist rule before the Nazis came in, the Italian fascist rule in Albania. And you said he mentioned that it was your grandmother's decision that led to his fate. But there's another way of reading this, and it feels very powerful, which is it was the Ypi name. The sins of the father were going to come and get the son because there was almost no escape from that. The family, this wasn't just another family who had roots in Ottoman rule. This was the son of the fascist prime minister. And it's quite hard to imagine many scenarios in which that wasn't going to be a problem after 1945. And that's a very different kind of story. That's a different kind of haunting. That's a very different kind of loss of agency, which is you're trapped by your name. And it comes up in Free as well. Obviously, when you finally, your parents have kept this from you, what the name means, and then you discover it and are shocked by it. But that would be a completely different way of reading what happened. We're all trapped in some ways. We don't choose our names and we don't choose our parents or our grandparents. And that's a different kind of loss of agency, loss of maybe even loss of dignity, because you are the victim of what people who came before you have done.
He was trapped by the name. I am still trapped by the name because I often see my trolls on social media who kind of keep posting this, that I am the granddaughter of this prime minister, collaborator, and so on. So you can never really, leave behind your family background. And part of what I was trying to also do with the book was to actually precisely present the story not just as my family story. This relates to the twist at the end that we don't want to spoil for readers, but in part why it's important to not tell the stories just as your own personal story, as your connection to a particular person, but also as a history of an era and of characters who lived in an era, and to kind of reconstruct more general patterns, is to also be able to actually escape this slavery of identity, because identity can be liberating and often is used as a platform for liberation, and it's very important that it does so, but it can also just be a trap. And sometimes I think the way to escape that, and it's why it's partly so crucial to the method of the book, that it is told there's this change of voice. There's first the first person when I write about me and going in the files and checking the files and reading, and then when I write the more novelistic part, it shifts to the third person, because I wanted to recover this 19th century novel form of having a writer that actually is impersonated in all the different characters in this polyphonic way, that each of these characters, the writer inhabits them, identifies with them, and presents their outlook on the world, also as a way of actually escaping this identity. And I think it connects to the final message of the book, that is that the only way in which we can maybe really escape is through art and through the use of the imagination. And that's why it goes back where it started, to this discussion between Schiller and Kant, because Kant thought that, it was just we had to act morally and follow the categorical imperative, and that the categorical imperative would eventually inspire political movements in the world. And this was written before the French Revolution. Schiller writes after the French Revolution, reflecting on this, and says, well, look, the French Revolution was in many ways very progressive, but also in many other ways a very terrible mess. And so it's clear that institutions here and now are not giving you reconciliation. In fact, they risk giving you more disillusionment and more disenchantment, because it shows you that actually every time you try, you fail so badly, and it's just a tragedy. And so where do we find hope, and where do we find ways of moving forward? And he says, well, maybe just in the kind of power of art, and Schiller says in the poets, and has these ideas of, classical Greece acting as an ideal, as a kind of regulative ideal for how we think about this relationship between art and morality and politics. But I think I've ended up more or less in the same way as Schiller. And in part, I think also because I think we now live in an age where it's really easy to observe how institutions fail these very basic norms. And so we don't live in an age that can offer reconciliation through politics. Of course, there are different political projects. They're not all the same, and some are more productive than others. And it's really important not to lose sight of the differences between them. But it's also because it's such an age of disenchantment and disillusionment, and you need this way of thinking about hope and evidence that there is some hope, and this question of where do you find hope. I think this Schiller-Kant debate Schiller writes about this in the letters on aesthetic education, and it's very much part of a project on education and the role of art in its connection to politics, and that's where I've kind of ended up with both the book, but in my thinking as well.
It probably goes without saying that Lea's new book, Indignity, is highly recommended. You can get it now, wherever you get your books. Lea's going to be joining us in October for one of the films in our season at the Regent Street Cinema in London. She and I are going to be talking about Rosa Luxemburg. But before that, the second film in our season is on Thursday, the 25th of September. It's another amazing film, My Dinner with Andre, and we've got another fascinating guest. Lee Hall, the writer of Billy Elliot, the film, the musical, the phenomenon, and of many other things too, from Wittgenstein on Tyne all the way through to Rocket Man, the biopic of Elton John. To come and see My Dinner with Andre and then hear a live recording of PPF with me and Lee Hall, get your tickets now. Just click on the link in our show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, and go to events. Next time, we're starting a new series. We're calling it Fixing Democracy. It's talking to people who have ideas about how democracy could work better. Some of them inspired by suggestions from our listeners. And we're going to be beginning with a conversation with David Klemperer from the Constitution Society. He's going to be talking about electoral reform. Could proportional representation save British democracy? American democracy? Is it the answer? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.